Monsieur le vice-président du Conseil d'État, Monsieur le directeur de l'Éducation nationale qui n'est pas encore arrivé, Madame la présidente du Comité économique et social, chers amis, ce soir, nous avons le plaisir d'avoir comme orateur à la Monaco Méditerranée Foundation Alan Friedman, expert, grand journaliste, expert en économie et politique. Je ne vais pas m'attarder sur sa biographie, car nous le connaissons tous très bien. Il a étudié à la London School of Economics, puis à l'université à New York. Il a commencé sa carrière au Financial Times, puis au New York Times, et enfin, directeur du Wall Street Journal. Il a reçu 4 fois le British Press Award, qui est l'équivalent britannique du prix Pulitzer. Il a interviewé durant sa carrière Bill Clinton, Vladimir Poutine, Donald Trump. Il a travaillé aussi comme commentateur dans plusieurs chaînes de télévision, particulièrement à la BBC, la RAI, Sky, en Italie. Alan a produit aussi des documentaires, dont un a eu un grand succès, qui s'appelle My Way sur Silvio Berlusconi, et Netflix l'a distribué dans 190 pays dans le monde. Mais Alan est aussi un écrivain. Son œuvre est marquée par une approche rigoureuse et surtout par un souci de rendre accessibles à tous des sujets souvent complexes. Il a publié plusieurs livres dont certains sont devenus des best-sellers internationaux, comme La trahison, Tremblement de terre, Les bâtards. Son dernier livre, dont 150 copies vous seront offertes à la sortie de la conférence, est La fin de l'Empire américain, guide au Nouveau Désordre Mondial. Nous vous remercions de ne pas prendre plus d'un livre par personne ou un par couple. Sans ça, il n'y en aura pas pour tout le monde. Je passe la parole à Alan qui, suite aux élections américaines, nous parlera d'un pays qui n'a jamais été aussi divisé. Veuillez vous joindre à moi pour accueillir chaleureusement Alan Friedman. Alan.
Merci madame, merci et bonsoir à tout le monde. Je m'excuse que je parlerai en anglais ce soir, mais comme vous savez, nous Américains ne sommes pas très, voilà. Alors, we are gathered here tonight in a moment that I would call historical, and not in a good way. I believe that we are in the middle of a moment of epochal change in the global power systems, in the way the world is governed, in the way we relate among ourselves in Europe and America, and in the way we deal with the challenges of the future, but also of the present. I was telling our friends from Monaco Hebdo before that many times in history, when there is collective trauma in society, like in the 1920s, after World War I, after the Spaniola pandemic, after the Great Depression, that tends to give rise, in many countries, to the emergence of populist demagogic leaders. I'm telling you all this because I want to make sure we understand that Donald Trump is not the only person we have to worry about in this world, because we're dealing with a global phenomenon. In this global phenomenon, when there is collective trauma and the income disparities are too great and the suffering of the lower middle classes and the working classes become too much, these populists tend to come to power promising to fix everything, promising simple, easy solutions to complex problems. There are no easy solutions to complex problems. And generally scapegoating those who are responsible for economic or social suffering. I could be talking about today in parts of the world or America, or I could be talking about 1930s in Berlin or Italy or Spain. And in these moments, it's the bankers, the Jews, the homosexuals, the Catholics, the gypsies, the immigrants, the ethnic minorities, whoever is the scapegoat. A populist politician says it's their fault. We need to get rid of them. They're causing the problem. That's how authoritarian societies can develop after a democratic election. The elections of 1922 in Italy, 1933 in Germany were democratic elections. The election of 2024 in America has been a democratic election. And the Americans decided, my fellow countrymen, for the second time to elect Donald Trump. Not the first time, but after all the experience that we've had. The insurrection of January 6, 2021, the open racism, the misogyny, the hatred, the bowing down to Putin and dictators. Americans know who Donald Trump is. And so Americans probably know what they voted for. Not everybody, because there's a lot of ignorance, but a number of Americans understand that they want this, which is a big problem, because I could be cynical and say, well, we Americans, if this is what we want, we deserve 4 years of Donald Trump. But that would be cruel to say against my fellow Americans. And certainly the world doesn't deserve what could happen now. So I'm not here to talk about Donald Trump alone. I'm here to talk about a historic moment in which American power has already been in decline for decades, and why I think the next 4 years will accelerate that decline, why Europe will need to try to unify or face a very difficult and uncertain future. There's my speech in 1 minute. Now let's begin. The American empire, I don't use the word empire the way left-wing intellectuals use the word empire. It always was a favorite of Marxists. I use the word empire to describe the fact that in 1945, at the end of the Second World War, America was the only military, economic, and political power left standing after the war. We know that. The world was destroyed. But we Americans then took that power, we developed our anti-Soviet containment theory, we kept a lot of immigrants out, a lot of refugees that could have come to America, and Roosevelt closed the door. So Roosevelt wasn't actually the great hero that everybody thought he was. Roosevelt was a rich dilettante who went to Yalta and Potsdam, sat down with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin, and gave away Eastern Europe because he didn't understand what was going on. After Roosevelt, we had all sorts of exaggerated scares, the McCarthy scare of the 1950s. There's communists in Hollywood, there's communists under the bed. There were communists everywhere in America. And that was a form of populism. Then we had another president who I was taught in school was one of our greatest presidents, John F. Kennedy. Well, John F. Kennedy caused the Cuban Missile Crisis by allowing the CIA to invade the Bay of Pigs in Cuba, and the Russians wanted revenge. And then he solved it, luckily. Luckily. John F. Kennedy increased from a few hundred people in Vietnam to 16,000 American troops in Vietnam in the 12 months before he was assassinated. If John F. Kennedy had lived, it would have been Kennedy who is guilty of waging that long war in Vietnam, and not Johnson and Nixon, as history now tells us. The traumas that occurred in America from the 1970s onward weakened our sense of ourselves as that city on the hill. We were the United States. Our philosophy has always been that we are the indispensable nation, the only power on the earth that can make the world safe for democracy. And indeed, in my own career in the White House and Pentagon and in working with people in Washington and knowing them, it is true that probably about 50% of the people who work in the American government really believe that we have a special responsibility in the world. The other 50% are happy for the CIA to change a regime, assassinate somebody there, and call it democracy, call it making the world. We have a certain hypocrisy. We have an impossible task. We cannot be morally superior while we engage in underhanded regime change. But that's American history, recent American history. When the Cold War finally ended, after years of collective trauma, the humiliation that Jimmy Carter suffered in 1979 and 80 when hostages in Tehran were put in the US Embassy and held until Reagan arrived. The scandal of Watergate, the first time a president of the United States resigned in a scandal. Today, Richard Nixon looks like a gentleman and a great, decent fellow compared to Donald Trump. But then, in Italy, I guess, Silvio Berlusconi looks like a moderate, liberal gentleman compared to the trash that we sometimes find in the government in Rome. Ministers of the Monegasque government don't repeat that because it's not diplomatic. I can say that as a journalist. So extremism is never a good thing, but it comes from failed management of empire and from trauma. In 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, and in 1991, when the Soviet Union was dissolved, George Herbert Walker Bush, the father of young Cowboy Bush, who we know more recently, old Bush, didn't have any strategic vision of what to do with America's power and how to deal with the fact that from 1989 until about 20 years ago, this was what we called a unipolar world in which America was the only superpower on the planet in political, military, and economic terms. And in that 12 years, that lost weekend between 1989 and 2001, we squandered an opportunity. And we had a President Bill Clinton who was very good on economic management because he had Bob Rubin running the Treasury. But he was so excited about globalization that he forgot that there was also a downside of globalization that could come back in like a boomerang in your face, which is if you disenfranchise too many workers, eventually the workers, if they feel they're too poor, they tend to rebel against the establishment. It's a lesson of history. And that happened as well with globalization. We don't need Thomas Piketty and Capital to tell us how this works. It's been going on for thousands of years on this planet. It's the way the world is run. Clinton embraced the idea of the end of history. The neoliberal world order had won. Well, no, it hadn't. And the attacks of 9/11 in September 2001 finally shook America, and we became even weaker and less consistent in our policies after that. We had a president who engaged in classical imperial overreach. Overreach? Overexpansion. He committed American military money and troops in Iraq and in Afghanistan. He spent thousands of billions of dollars, lost millions of lives, because we only talk about American lives lost, which were only tens of thousands, but the locals in Iraq and Afghanistan amount to more than 1 million people who died. And those two wars dragged America's power down over the last 20 years. We then came, after Bush, to what I describe in my book as the incompetent, bad management of the Arab Spring by Barack Obama. My criticism is not just for Republicans, it's also for Democrats, because for one reason or another, we've had the bad fortune to have made a lot of mistakes in the management of empire, because we Americans are not really good at managing empire. We don't even believe we have an empire. We would deny that we ever had an empire. But we've mismanaged it just the same. And what Barack Obama did in the Arab Spring with his inconsistency and the way he lost Libya and allowed Sarkozy to go crazy and kill Gaddafi was, I think, a big mistake. Today, Libya is controlled by Vladimir Putin and Erdogan, by Russia and Turkey. France and Italy have almost nothing to say in Libya. They do have gas and oil contracts still because money counts, but in terms of geopolitics, Libya is gone, folks. And half of Africa could go the way the Chinese are buying Africa and the way the Wagner Group and Putin penetrated and took over about 18 regimes in Russia, exploiting their raw materials and rewarding the corrupt local rulers. That's also a reality which people don't like to talk about. After Obama, we had the dismantling of America's involvement in the Paris Climate Accords and so many other multilateral institutions in Trump 1, the first Trump government. We understood what Trump was about. Europe found it very difficult. We began to learn that you could be transactional, you could use flattery, you could try to be friends with Trump to see if he would favor you over a rival. It's a very unpredictable game when you're dealing with somebody whose decisions are not strategic, but personal. In all of this time, the divisions in America and society have been growing. And as our divisions as a nation have grown, we have become weaker as a power. The global South, in the words of Bill Burns, still the director of the CIA today, in my book, he says, the global South of South Africa and India and Brazil and all the emerging powers, they don't want a monogamous relationship with Washington anymore. They don't want to be Washington's only ally. They want to pick and choose. And if Putin offers something good, if China offers something good, America is not number one in their calculations, and often they don't even care about the fact that one is democratic and the other is dictatorship. Look at Lula. He'll do business with anybody. Look at Modi. He'll buy cheap gas and oil from Russia, treating Russia like a discount gas station in Siberia. And he's the most racist and authoritarian leader, Mr. Modi in India, and he's also a bad economic policymaker. So often these populists are not good at economic policy. We will arrive in a moment to discuss Trump's threat of tariffs, commercial trade wars, and all that, but let me just develop the argument a little bit more as we talk about the global South. Because in the new world disorder that is emerging, there will be no bipolar world. It's not going to be America versus China. China will overtake the United States as the world's largest economy in about 5 or 6 years, by the early 2030s. But that's statistical. It's not really that important. It's a statistic about GDP. The real issue will arise in about 20, 25 years, when by most estimates, China will equal the United States in military power. That's when it gets interesting. I personally do not believe, having known various Chinese presidents and prime ministers in the last 30 years, I don't believe that they will launch some kind of a crazy and reckless attack on Taiwan unless we provoke them by doing the kind of stupid things that Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden did, escalating the rhetoric, sending people to openly attack them instead of realizing that the only good diplomacy is private. And when it becomes public, you've already failed. Having said that, China will be a rival, but the new world disorder we're facing will not be linear. Tariffs, deportations, and other threats. Let's talk about Trump's policies. Will the trade war against Canada and Mexico and China and Europe be as bad as we fear? Probably against China, yes. Against Canada and Mexico, no. And against Europe, no. Why is that, in my opinion? Because Trump has a Secretary of Treasury called Scott Bessent. Scott he's the man who broke the Bank of England in 1992 with George Soros by taking that bet on sterling. He's now the Secretary of Treasury designate, the man who broke the Bank of England with that multi-billion-dollar speculation on the sterling, just so we remember who we've got here. But wasn't Soros supposed to be the bad guy for Trump world? Yes, but Trump's flexible. And also, if you sign your loyalty pledge, as Scott Bessent has, he's even more flexible. Am I worried that Scott Bessent will embrace Trump's worst instincts on protectionism? No, I think Scott Bessent will moderate Trump a little bit. Nobody can moderate Trump, but he will try. What worries me about Scott Bessent and American economic policy is, one, that the basic principles of protectionism and tariffs lead to slower GDP growth and higher inflation in the lag period of 6 to 12 months after they're imposed, 18 months if you wish. Therefore, you can be Trump, come into office with all sorts of unworkable economic policies like protectionism. You cut taxes, create more deficit and debt in the States while you're doing protectionism. You get a short-term sugar high. The endorphins of the American economy roar, and it seems like he's done something good, and then after a year, 18 months, you get the bill that arrives, and it's a very high-priced bill for protectionism that ultimately is a boomerang on those who administer it, and everybody knows that, except for Donald Trump. What worries me about Scott Bessent as Treasury Secretary is that he wants to take away the independence of the Federal Reserve Board. Ladies and gentlemen, the day that the White House succeeds in installing a crony or a puppet or a political man or woman inside the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve, if that ever happens, I'm coming to live here in Monte Carlo. It will be a terrible, terrible world, and American credibility and the dollar will suffer as a result. Is this one of those many threats that Trump and his people make, and all you cynical Europeans say, Alan, politicians say things in campaigns, but when they arrive at the White House, they're actually a lot more moderate. This time it could be a little different for the United States. I know that's hard to believe, but if you look at the people that Trump has nominated already, you see a kind of Addams family of grotesque freaks. Sorry, that's not very diplomatic. Well, let's take some examples. As Director of National Intelligence, a former Putin propagandist, Mrs. Tulsi Gabbard, a strange member of a religious cult from Hawaii who has spent years praising Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian dictator, and praising Vladimir Putin and criticizing and attacking as a criminal Vladimir Zelensky. If Tulsi Gabbard becomes the Director of National Intelligence, we might as well have just asked Putin to send one of his people to run it, because we will have a steady filter through to Moscow. Maybe that handful of Republican moderates, 5 or 6 senators in the Republican Senate, will stop Tulsi Gabbard the way they stopped the appointment of the Justice Minister, who unfortunately had been charged with rape and sex trafficking. That's a detail in Trump world. And if you count the number of cabinet appointments who have been accused of sexual molestation or rape, I think it's up to 5 different men right now, and 1 woman who was actually in the wrestling world and is perhaps the most vulgar and wacky person ever put in charge of the Department of Education. But the mission of Donald Trump is to eliminate the Department of Education, give it all to the states, and stop the idea of state schooling. And that's what Elon Musk wants as well. Will that happen? It might, yeah, it might. Will the Department of Education be cut in half? At least. Will the Environmental Protection Agency, now to be staffed by an oil industry lobbyist, be cut down? Sure. Will a number of regulations be slashed by Musk and by Trump? Yes. Some of them, it'll be good that they're cutting regulations, because not all regulations are good. Some are there to protect consumers and public health and safety, and some are there and they're too much bureaucracy, and it's good to cut them. But what Trump and company have in mind will probably weaken the American government from the inside. The part that gets scary is when he wants to put conspiracy theorists into running our national health system and the FBI. The fellow who's going to be put in the FBI is one of those people who cheered on January 6th. In fact, most of Trump's nominees, including Pete Hegseth, the Fox News anchor who's supposed to run the Pentagon, $900 billion budget, 3 million employees, and all he's ever really done is gone on television, opened his jacket, and showed that he has tattoos from the neo-Nazis on his chest. Pete Hegseth is a dangerous fellow, but he probably will be confirmed as head of the Pentagon. So that changes things. And what could be very worrying is if Trump really does decide to use the FBI or the Department of Justice to try to indict, put on trial, or put in prison political rivals. That would not be democracy. And even though that sounds banal to say it like that, I urge you to watch in the next 6 months. And I guarantee you will see already in the next 90 days rhetoric coming from the new Trump administration about prosecuting those prosecutors who investigated Trump for his crimes. And if that remains just threats and rhetoric but doesn't happen, then Trump's just a crazy guy and we're safe. But if you actually start arresting members of the Biden family or just normal people like the press, Elon Musk said that they would arrest mayors of cities if they tried to block the mass deportation of 11 million people. I don't know how many Europeans know this, but Trump, on day 1, January 20th, plans to declare a state of emergency in the United States, use the United States military, the army, to go out and arrest people and put them in detention camps and then deport them. Now, we Americans have 11 million undocumented workers, but the difference between our undocumented workers and the ones in Europe is that yours usually arrive as refugees from a war, come through the Balkans, or come from Africa across the water, whereas in America, the people who come from the Mexican border and came here 20 years ago, apart from illegally arriving in America, they become American. They go to school, they pay their taxes, they pay Social Security, their pension contributions. They're actually productive people. And the United States could not survive economically if they took away all the poor people who are paid $5 an hour to pick tomatoes and bananas and grapes in agriculture in America, because they're all Mexican undocumented workers. Even some of the companies in California are now asking Trump, please don't deport everybody. I have a lot of illegal workers. Trump, by the way, had several illegal servants working at Mar-a-Lago, but that's a detail that doesn't matter. And so we're going to have a real issue there. And we're going to have an issue also in Europe, because what happens for a Matteo Salvini or a Le Pen or any of these, or Wilders or any of these jokers, when they see Trump moving forward with anti-immigrant policies or strong identity politics that is extremist. The Europeans feel empowered, legitimized, and so you will get a ricochet effect of whatever Trump does being repeated in miniature at a time when Europe itself, in my judgment, is facing an existential crisis. It's not just about Viktor Orban anymore. It's not just about fifth columnists. It's about a tendency across Europe to embrace the extremist anti-immigrant hatred, to embrace the idea of a less democratic society in order to have more food on the table. And when people are hungry, and when the working classes can't eat, they tend to first support extremists, then they rebel. And we're going through the extremist phase in Western society. The United States, I believe, is condemned to repeat many of the mistakes of history because, as I write in a chapter called The United States of Amnesia, we Americans don't really study our history. But then very few people really study their histories. And so history doesn't repeat itself, but as Mark Twain said, it rhymes. The 1930s was a period of increasing illiberal democracy, as is happening in parts of Europe. My fear is not that America becomes a dictatorship, but that America goes through a sort of urbanization and becomes a more illiberal democracy. Or, for those of you who remember John Locke and Hobbes, America becomes a more nasty and brutish society, less civilized than you already think it is. And that's a problem for America. An America that embraces dictators, that attacks its allies, that deports people, that uses the levers of government to prosecute its enemies, that would not be a democratic America. I am not predicting that all those bad things will happen. I am simply sharing with you that even if only a third to a half of these things happen, it will be horrible for America and bad for Europe. Really, you have to ask yourself, will the next 4 years of Trump be horrible or just bad? Or as the Italians say, will it be serio o grave? And for those of you in the audience who are cynical, you'll say, no, Wall Street will have 6 months, 12 months of good times, the dollar remain forward, then we can speculate on the hedge funds when the dollar takes a dip. We can play this. Trump has always been good for the economy. Not this time. Not this time. You're going to have to live through the experience to realize some months from now that that Friedman fellow who was warning that this Trump will be different and that American power will continue to decline, but America will continue to do harm to the world system, I suspect in a few months that will become more clear. With Europe's weakness, with China's patience, we face a world that won't be bipolar, it won't be multipolar. It'll be a world where the law of the jungle is more important than the rules-based system. Now, from China's point of view, and I do devote a lot of space in this book, and I'd like to spend a little bit of time here reminding everyone that although Chinese leader Xi Jinping is a brutal dictator, he's probably the smartest political leader operating and running a big country in the world today, a great power. He's very cynical, he's very shrewd, he studied Confucius, he understands that patience is what Confucius teaches. In 1972, Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon sat down with Mao Zedong in Beijing, and Nixon started asking about Taiwan. What do we do about Taiwan? And Mao Zedong said to Nixon and Kissinger, relax. We'll be ready to take that in 50 or 100 years from now. We're in no rush. Because the Chinese understand long-term planning. I remember interviewing Zhu Rongji when he was still the mayor of Shanghai, then prime minister of China in the 90s, 30 years ago. And he said, we're only at the beginning of our economic reforms. It'll take us another 30 years before our economic strength comes, and we don't really need to talk about political reforms until maybe the 2050s. That was the Chinese vision, and they're not wrong. They're not wrong. That's the way they operate. That's the way they roll. And they are very effective. They've bought half of Africa with their trillion-dollar giveaway of equity that's converted into debt in the Bridge and Road Initiative, soft power. The Chinese strategy is basically to build a logistics network that supports and facilitates Chinese supply chains of sales of Chinese exports everywhere else in the world, South America, Asia, and Europe. That's the game. And to get as much cheap oil from the Middle East by presenting itself as the honest broker, it was China that brought together Saudi Arabia and Iran in a diplomatic rapprochement. It was China that poor old Tony Blinken went to a few months ago when the United States of America had to ask China to intervene with Iran to ask the Houthis to stop attacking the ships in the Red Sea. That's a fact, you can look it up. But imagine that the United States of America, in order to reduce attacks on its own ships and European ships, went to China asking China to use its influence with Iran, to use its influence with the Houthis. Now, it's true. Netanyahu has destroyed much of the Hamas and Hezbollah and Houthi infrastructure. But it's also true, and it's promising, that there's a ceasefire that poor old Biden and Blinken finally got, Netanyahu to agree to. I personally don't believe that Netanyahu agreed to the ceasefire to please Joe Biden. He can't stand Joe Biden. He did it because Donald Trump is already running American foreign policy from Mar-a-Lago. They've already made a deal that, wait, keep things cool, I'll be there in 2 months, and then if you have to do any more cleaning up, this is Trump to Netanyahu, you'll go ahead with my blessing. If you have to annex the West Bank, you'll go ahead with my blessing. Remember, his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, has a major $2 billion investment from Saudi Arabia to facilitate investments in the West Bank and Serbia and other pro-Putin countries. So the family that does business together doesn't make peace together. And the problem we're facing in the Middle East is that Trump will give carte blanche to Netanyahu, but he will make it look like he's a hero. In terms of Ukraine, it's worth just remembering that in 2019, the first time Trump was impeached, it was because he had tried to blackmail Zelensky on a telephone call on July 25th saying, I'm not going to send you any military support to resist Putin unless you first get me some dirt on Biden. And when Zelensky declined to cooperate, we know the rest of the story. The fact that we have an unpunished, convicted felon as president would have been outrageous years ago. It doesn't matter today. And all of the things that would have caused us to be upset or angry in the past don't matter anymore, because in America, there are facts, and then there are alternative facts, or fake news. And people who know how to read, or people who've studied, understand that when Trump said in the campaign, inflation is Biden's fault, that was false. They understand how geopolitics, COVID, supply chain disruptions, and other things create inflation. When Trump said, your mortgage rates are too high, that's Biden's fault, he put up the rates, obviously that's false, but most Americans don't even understand what the Federal Reserve Board is, let alone understanding that it raises interest rates to fight inflation, and that causes your mortgage to go up. We're expecting too much from a very uneducated and ignorant mass of people, my countrymen. That's a harsh thing for me to say. And this book has been difficult because it's not easy to criticize your own country. I love America, but to look at what we've become and what we risk right now is very disturbing. That brings me to my final point. I think I'm just on 40 minutes, and I hope there'll be some questions and some interaction. My final point is this the 1930s? After all these warnings, Mr. Friedman, what are you actually saying? And what I'm trying to say is that it's not going to be as bad as, we're not going into a world war, we're not going into a situation that's violent and dramatic in America. We're going into a situation where the government leader and most of his cabinet have zero respect for democracy and zero respect for convention and zero respect for normal civilized government. So that could be a problem. And Europe will not be up to the task. Europe desperately needs some kind of unified common defense. It was first proposed in the 1950s in the old European coal and steel community. It never took off because, obviously, which government wants to give up its sovereign right to have an army and decide? Very few governments are willing to do so. It is possible, in my judgment, that a handful of big countries will band together if Trump really abandons Europe as much as he might and really exposes Europe to Putin's threats, which again, if I say really, I mean I expect it to happen a little bit, but the question is, does it happen a lot or a little bit? And I don't know the answer to that. We'll find out. But if Germany and France and Spain and Italy and Britain and some of the other countries were to get together, even 7 or 8 countries that have the major forces, they could create a small but effective coordinated European defense. But for that to happen, you'd need political stability and leadership in those countries. And right now, as you know, France is paying more for its bonds than Greece, is on the verge of a potential financial crisis if Marine Le Pen and the team stop the budget, stop the tax increases and the expense cuts in the French government, then France could be going through a period of financial turmoil, as well as a political crisis of government paralysis. And as for Germany, on February 23rd, I would fully expect the neo-Nazi Alternative for Deutschland to come in as the number 2 party. And I hope it's only number 2 and not number 1. And I fully expect Merz of Germany to emerge and try to do a deal where he brings the far right together with the Christian Democrats and seeks some stability. And I don't believe that'll work too well. Certainly, anything would be better than the cowardly, spineless, and ineffectual leadership of Mr. Scholz, who really is the mayor of Hamburg, who should have stayed in Hamburg because he's not a very good chancellor. Sorry, almost done. As for Britain, the idea of Britain, Germany, France, Spain, Italy getting together, you'd need a Britain that's part of Europe or willing to be part of Europe. Not so easy. And if you ask me about Italy, I'll tell you that Giorgia Meloni will be in the government until 2032, not just 2027, that the left is discredited and weak and screwed up in Italy. So in order to have European unity to defend against a world in which Trump is no longer loyal to Europe and Europe could be left vulnerable, you would need European leadership, but we don't have European leadership. So sometimes when I give a talk, my Italian wife tells me that I tend to induce collective suicide. And wherever I go to speak about geopolitics and macroeconomics, I try to find something positive to say. Until recently, at least, I could say interest rates are coming down, but that's not even so sure anymore. that those interest rates will keep coming down. Put simply, the election of Donald Trump is not the cause of all this. It's just a manifestation, like the pus that comes out of a spot, a brucella. Donald Trump is an ugly example of fear and anger in the Western world, but the disease is contagious across Europe as well. And in macroeconomic terms, we will have more friendshoring, more false autarkies. You cannot replace the semiconductor business in China and Taiwan in 10 years of investments in America or Europe. It doesn't work. In America, they could spend hundreds of billions of dollars building new chip plants for intelligent semiconductor chips. And in 10 years, after spending hundreds of billions of dollars, all the data shows that we Americans will have reduced our dependence on China and Asia for chips from 75% down to 65%. Not enough. Europe is worse off. You don't have lithium. You don't have rare earth. You don't have the know-how. So we go into a very challenging time in economic terms, a Europe that is weak, a Germany that could have both recession and political crisis. You could have Germany and France within 2 or 3 months as Trump takes power, both of them semi-paralyzed by political crisis and economic troubles. If that isn't enough to induce a collective suicide, I don't have any other predictions that are more pessimistic. I hope I'm wrong. I hope you will criticize me. I hope you will say, Alan, it sounds too dark. Have some faith in your own country. And I don't exclude the possibility that my great country, which is a great country, is resilient and that we Americans can come back from time to time. But as Ferdinand Braudel wrote, there is a long arc of history. And I believe that the trends we're describing here are inexorable, won't be stopped, won't be changed, and will simply be something we will have to live with for the rest of our lives. Thank you for your attention. I'm not sure how this
Ladies
works.
and gentlemen, if you have any question.
Okay, that's how it works. Sir.
Hello. Hi, Mr. Friedman. Firstly, thanks for the speech. It was very insightful. My question is around demographics. And we see that they're collapsing pretty much everywhere, but especially in China, vis-a-vis the United States, whose fertility rate is below replacement level, but is still relatively high among developed countries. So if you could explore that a bit in looking ahead 20, 30 years, how that will affect the current geopolitical situation and the uni or multipolar world. Thank you.
In macroeconomic terms, the demographic trends in the world today favor India and Southeast Asia and Africa as the economies that will be really on top of the world in 20 years. Indonesia will be the 3rd or 4th biggest economy in the world. Indonesia will be the most exciting growth economy you've ever heard of in the 2030s, but people don't realize that yet. The demography of the United States, we know. The demography of Europe, we know. The demography of China, we know. In all cases, these are aging populations. In a country like Italy, the projections are that in 60 or 70 years, they'll go from 60 million people down to 35 million people in population, which is what makes it so amazing that when you're losing your population and you can't fill jobs, what do? Close the doors to immigrants, which is why right-wing extremists don't always have very intelligent economic policies. I was referring to Giorgia Meloni, by the way. In the case of China, China will go below 1 billion, will drop probably about 400, 500 million people in the next 40, 50 years. And India will continue to grow. India and Southeast Asia, 2/3 of the populations are under the age of 30. They've still got that. Africa, Of course, there are 5 or 6 different Africas: Anglophone, Francophone, democratic, dictatorial, sub-Sahara, this or that. But there are parts of Africa that will be as exciting, thanks to demography and resources, as were the Southeast Asian tigers in the late 1990s. All that is coming. What does it mean for Europe? It could mean that much of Europe will be increasingly deindustrialized, including bits of Germany, the great industrial power. And it could be that much of Europe, even though this is going to sound trite and overly simplistic, will be a kind of Disneyland for rich Chinese tourists, as it were. I know that's simplistic, but the concept is what I'm offering, not the detail. So demography plays a role. Demography does not favor any of the existing powers, and they go through cycles. Why do I think China will continue, however, notwithstanding this problem, to be strong? Because China, first of all, they have more thousands of billions, more trillions of foreign exchange reserves than you can imagine. This decade, objectively speaking, for China is almost a write-off. The real estate crisis that Xi Jinping engineered is a tragedy. The unemployment rate in China is probably 300 or 400 million people, with another 300 million of underemployed. That's half of a population of 1.4 billion people. That's a big social problem that China has. But they have the money, they have the time, they don't have to answer to a free press or a parliament. So I think they slog through it. And just 2 weeks ago, Xi Jinping said, we're going to spend $1,400 billion to fix things up in the Chinese economy. Not many countries can throw that kind of money around. That's not a very complete answer, but demography, you're right in your assumptions, and it will favor different parts of the world in future economic growth. Anybody else? Sir.
Thank you very much. Congratulations for what you said. According to you, we are in 2024, November 2024. What could the Democrats do to win in 2028, knowing that criticizing Trump policy didn't work, bringing big stars didn't work to support them? What could they do now? What are they going to do?
The Democrats are going to flounder. They're going to criticize each other. They're going to bet on the wrong people to be their future leaders. The Democrats will probably make every possible mistake you can make. Sort of like the socialists in France after François Hollande saw the vote go down to, what, 2%? Which election was it that the French socialists just dropped under the floor? Center-left parties in France, Germany, Italy, America, are all torn by internal divisions between the radical left and the moderate pro-business left. They're all torn by the fact that working class voters vote for right-wing parties in most democracies these days and not for the left. It's not like the old days. In the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher already stole the working class voters from Labour in Britain, and you began to hear about working class Tories in Britain, meaning you see more hope for your future in somebody who looks like they're a smart, popular manager type and promises to make everything better. That will be the same effect in America. We have lost, the Democrats in America have completely lost contact. I always felt Kamala Harris was a lightweight, not particularly brilliant, adequate as such, with a career that had been helped greatly in California through personal assistance from personal sponsors, like the former mayor of San Francisco, who got her a job, got her elected at the state level. I'm glad that tonight nobody is going to ask me why a nation like America can't come up with two better candidates than Biden or Kamala or Trump. And then I tend to scratch my head and say, well, you know, we're living in the age of mediocrity, and Biden should have gone before, but Biden, once an American president decides he wants to seek a second term, the practice in American politics is you don't challenge him. The only time an American president was challenged was 1968, when Bobby Kennedy and Gene McCarthy challenged President Johnson for the Democratic nomination, and Johnson was forced to withdraw. Clearly, Biden is no longer presentable, which doesn't mean he's senile, just means he's no longer presentable. Clearly, Biden should never have been the candidate last January. Clearly, Kamala Harris, well, actually, no, not clearly. Not everybody knows the story, so I have 2 more minutes. The Democratic Party has been controlled for the last few years by 2 clans, 2 families, the Clinton family and the Obama family, together with Nancy Pelosi, the former Speaker of the House of Representatives. This old-fashioned power political machinery, control of resources, control of candidates, very old-fashioned. I don't think it's been good for the Democrats, because these people really are the elitists that Trump is criticizing, and they lend credibility to Trump's attack on elitists, because there's nothing more elite than having a nightcap at Davos at midnight with Bill Clinton, who says he's got an H. Upmann or a Cohiba in his glass and wants the Remy Special. Bill Clinton, if you meet him these days, you'd think he was born with a silver spoon. The guy's really very, very careful about his wine vintages and his tastes. He's had too much of the good life. He's lost contact, as his wife lost contact, as the Obamas. The Obamas took a $60 million payment from Netflix to do some documentaries and a bit more for their books. So their net worth went up to about $120, $130 million after they left the White House. Now Barack prefers to go to Necker Island in the Caribbean to Richard Branson's place and, you know, hang. These people killed Joe Biden in July. Nancy Pelosi said, we've got to get rid of him. If he won't step down, we'll push him off. We'll start a whispering campaign. We'll send people to see him. She did that. They killed him. Joe Biden was so angry because Obama, Clinton, and Nancy thought, we're going to have a primary season in July and August and have different Democratic candidates compete. And we won't have a candidate until the end of August. This was their idea. This is how bereft of intelligence and ideas they are. The Democrats thought they could have a primary season in the middle of the summer. Biden endorsed Kamala Harris 22 minutes after he withdrew in order to send a message to Obama and Clinton and Nancy Pelosi, which was not very friendly. So all that internal dynamic. But the real answer to your question is, Kamala Harris says she wants to run again. God, I hope she doesn't. Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, is a charismatic, presentable, handsome, pro-business, social conscience. He's in favor of the free market. He was once married to the woman who's now with Donald Trump Jr., but there we are. That's a personal matter, and that's her fault, not his. So there could be a Newsom candidacy, but what do I think will happen? I think the Democrats will try to make a comeback in 2022. Because as you all know, in the midterm elections, 2 years after a presidential election, usually the opposite party wins back the House or Senate. If the Americans continue in 2022 to reward Donald Trump and to keep the majority, the Republican majority in the House and Senate, I give up. Then there is no hope. Again, I don't mean America is ending. I mean we're approaching the twilight of the American century. We're not finished. We've got another 20, 30 years of strong American leadership with flaws, but we're not going to have a long-term future as a power because it happens in world history that these things happen. It's just that we Americans don't like to talk about it. Last question? 2, 3, 4.
It was a great analysis. I share a lot of the things that you did, that you presented. However, it is very pessimistic, and that scares the hell out of me, personally.
Yeah, it should.
Number two is, we cannot forget that since 4 years, Donald Trump has been campaigning.
Mm-hmm.
I think the idea of not recognizing, the election being cheated and so on and so forth, continued and gave him a lot of fuel to push that. The other thing is that
plus the assassination attempt.
also, the other issue on the Democratic side was the fact that they abandoned their base completely.
Mm-hmm.
So they didn't do anything about that stuff. That caused a lot of problems in this area. I don't believe that Obama was in favor of Harris. I totally agree with you.
In favor
of Kamala Harris.
No, he wasn't.
She wasn't, yeah.
No, he didn't want. Obama and the Clintons did not want Kamala Harris.
Right.
Joe Biden endorsed her to prevent them from choosing somebody else.
So
that's not speculation.
Okay.
That's already in America pretty well documented.
The issue is that, is there any hope? That's my question. Because listening to what you presented is really doom and gloom in everything that we have seen in this area. I personally do believe and hope that, in 2 years there would be another midterm election. 2 years is short enough and will not hopefully give the Trump administration enough time to make the changes. But you know more than me. So that was my question, essentially, to know what it is.
Well, I appreciate what you said, and I want to repeat what I said. I've laid out a scenario that I believe will favor the worst side of things, not the better side of things. But I also said that I don't think Trump will achieve everything he's threatening to do. But I merely wanted to point out that in domestic, economic, foreign policy, and justice and other questions, he only needs to do about a third to half of what he said to disrupt the American system and damage international relations. And I believe that, as I said before, it sounds trite, but we'll have to see, does he really go off the deep end? No. Is he limited and blocked occasionally by some courts? Yeah. Will the balance of democracy be in the hands of 5 Republican senators who he will threaten, intimidate, and try to bribe all the time to be on his side for nominees and for legislation? Yes. This is the point. For the next 2 years, he can do a lot. Yes, he can do a lot. He can do more than you imagine. He can cancel health insurance for 40 million Americans with a decree. He can do a lot. If you want more favorable outlook, let's try and say, let's have more faith in the American people that 2 years from now, after they see what Trump is doing, they'll say, oh, we made a mistake. Maybe all those Hispanic, Cuban, and Dominican Hispanic ethnic Americans who voted like turkeys voting for Thanksgiving, who voted, anybody get that joke? Yeah. Who voted for a man who has been racist against them and who will deport their families, maybe they'll wake up. Maybe the African American males who have come over to Trump will understand that he is not their friend. But maybe not. Maybe not, because maybe we're beyond that. What I find most alarming and fascinating is that a large majority of young Americans between the age of 18 and 25 of Generation Z or Z voted for Trump, preferred Trump. So we did this to ourselves, and now we have to live with it And the problem is everybody has to live with it. And I repeat, sir, will it be as bad as the most horrible picture? No. But will enough bad things happen to cause us to closely examine our investment portfolios to look at the volatility in the markets, closely examine our basic principles about where we want to live and what we want to do in life? And will it damage expectations for a lot of tourism in Europe because of war fears? Also. Sir. Well, Elon Musk is, of course, as we know, a very controversial person. I've met him. I believe he's, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I believe he has a strong case of narcissism. I mean, he loves himself very much. That's obvious. You could call it genial that he bought and branded Tesla so well. And there's no doubt that his vision for space is highly, highly visionary and intelligent. It's not so good that the United States government and NASA are 99% dependent on Elon Musk for all space exploration. Every rocket that goes up has to be Elon Musk's rocket these days. It's not so good that he gets $18 billion from the government from NASA. It's not so good that he favors the anti-gay, anti-vax, anti-immigrant, anti-everything extremism. I personally view the conflict of interest that is developing with Elon Musk and even with Jeff Bezos and others. If you think about it, Jeff Bezos was supposed to be, he was only the third or fourth richest man in the world. He was supposed to be a more reasonable chap, somebody you could do business with, somebody you'd want to have lunch with. Then if you look at the way he and his wife dress, you might say no. But money is not associated with taste, as we know. But Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post, and he canceled the editorial that was going to endorse Kamala Harris 1 minute before it was going to be published, because he needed to get down on his knees before Trump. He was intimidated by Trump. He was afraid that he would lose billions of dollars of Amazon Group federal government contracts. He was probably right if he endorsed Kamala Harris. Self-censorship, I always thought was just the province of Italian journalists who were always, whoever they worked for, they censored themselves. But it's not just Italian journalists, it's also American billionaires who self-censor themselves. What we're developing with Musk is a kind of Soviet-style oligarchy in which, just like in Moscow, you get rid of the billionaires you don't like. Putin didn't like Khodorkovsky, gone. Didn't like Berezovsky, gone. Didn't like this one, gone. And you reward with fake nationalizations, privatizations, crony contracts, government contracts, and takeovers, your crony capital friends. This form of capitalism, very common in Malaysia, crony capitalism, and in lots of parts of Africa and parts of Latin America. It's more explicit than here in Europe. We're more organic here in Europe. Here we don't actually say we're employing our wife's son-in-law. We just do it. But in these crony capitalism systems, and America can become that, you develop oligarchs. And I believe that if I were writing a book on Elon Musk right now, it would be called American Oligarch. And it's not just me talking like this. All of my colleagues at the Financial Times of London, at the Wall Street Journal, at the New York Times, those who I respect, who I know when we talk, everybody says, they say worse things. They say this could become an oligarchy or an oligarchy and a kleptocracy at the same time. And that sounds very funny, but it's not so funny because it could happen in Washington, D.C. in the next few months. because Trump does not feel a need to disclose anything. We used to have this quaint tradition in America that when you get elected president, you put your assets in a blind trust. That doesn't exist anymore, thanks to Trump. We used to have this idea that there was a conflict of interest if you appointed somebody to run a government ministry because they were from the same sector. Not anymore. So the breaking of practices and norms is something that Trump specializes in. Usually the goal is money, more money than power. I'll say this for Trump. He's more motivated by greed than by the aphrodisiac of political power, in my judgment. Sir.
Thank you very much.
Does that mean we're finished, or you have your question? We're finished. You don't have a question. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Mesdames, messieurs, je vous prie de laisser vos traducteurs sur vos sièges, s'il vous plaît. Les traducteurs sur les sièges, s'il vous plaît.